Okay, I'm starting the unit on perfect competition, and this is the first of 4 market structures that we're going to look at. So market structures are across a spectrum, and as I mentioned in class, the perfect competition is the one that has the most firms. On the other end of the spectrum is monopoly, which is one firm. So here are some examples of different firms that would be in different types of market structures. The fast food market, the car market, Microsoft, the strawberry market, and the cereal market. And so at the end of the 4 market structure discussion, you should be able to identify and place these types of companies. So I'm going to just talk about perfect competition, a quick overview. Now, the remaining 3 are called imperfect competition. So the characteristics of perfect competition are the following. There's a lot of small firms. They have a homogeneous or a product that's not easily distinguishable from their competitor. There's low barriers to entry, meaning it's very easy to start up a firm or close it down. The seller, because they're producing a product that has not dissimilar than their competitor, they really don't have a need to advertise. And they're known as price takers because they don't have any control over price. Now on the flip side is monopoly. Monopoly is the rule of one, and the electric company would be an example. De Beers, which is a diamond manufacturer, and they are the market, or have been the market for many years because they control the diamond mines. So it's one large firm. They have a unique product. There's no close substitutes. Diamonds, you have zirconiums, but a diamond is a diamond. And there's generally high barriers to entry in this type of market structure. And because of the 3 characteristics that I just mentioned, they're known as price makers. They have complete control over price. So a monopoly wouldn't exist very long if there weren't high barriers to entry. And so types of barriers to entry are the following. Economies of scale. And we saw the economies of scale situation when we looked at the long-run average total cost curve a number of days ago, where because of high startup costs, factories, machineries, robots, etc., average total costs when you don't produce that much are pretty high. But as you produce a lot of the item, they diminish. So we have things called natural monopolies. If a utility creates the electric grid, there's a lot of upfront costs. Once they create the grid and they distribute the electricity to multiple people, millions of people, their average total costs are pretty low, and that's called a natural monopoly. They may have superior technology that they have that no one else has. And as I mentioned, if the monopolist controls the raw materials, such as the case with diamonds, that would present a very, very high barrier to entry. And then there are government-created barriers to entry, which create monopolies in the pharmaceutical industry for certain drugs, because the government will implement a patent which would protect inventors after they've created their product or idea, and it forbids others from using that invention. Oligopoly is the rule of a few from the Greek, and the characteristics of oligopoly are the cell phone providers, the car market, They have a few large producers. Generally, there are less than 10 firms that are in this industry. Their products are pretty similar, but they try to differentiate them. There's typically very, very high barriers to entry. You just can't start a cell phone company out of the blue. And they have control over price. They are also price makers, but they are interdependent because they always have their eye on what their competitor is doing. So they don't necessarily set the price without keeping their competition in mind. And that's called mutual interdependence. And there's a lot of strategic behavior with monopolies. With oligopolies. And it's going to be an interesting time when we examine that market. The final one is monopolistic competition. And the characteristics of this industry is there are fast food, furniture, shoe stores. There's a relatively large number of sellers. There are a lot of fast food markets out there. And they sell differentiated products. A hamburger is not a hamburger, right? Then you have a Wendy's hamburger, you have a McDonald's hamburger, you have Five Guys hamburger, you have Shake Shack hamburger. There's lots of different characteristics of the hamburger that differentiate it from their competitor. So they do have some control over price. And it's generally pretty easy to enter this industry. If you want to sell hamburgers, you can break into the market. And they have a lot of advertising in order to entice people to purchase their product. On the local level, it might be flyers, it might be, digital ads, or, in your email account that you might get advertisements for these types of firms. And so perfect competition is the one that we're going to look at. And I'm just going to run through this. We already said this, so I don't have to say it again. All right, so one characteristic of perfectly competitive markets is that individual firms. I'll let you figure out the answer. And hopefully you've chosen B as your answer. All right, so demand for perfectly competitive firms. It's really important that you understand how we graph perfectly competitive firms. And the first thing that you have to understand is, why are they price takers? Well, they're price takers because, there are many firms in this industry, and if one firm decides to charge something above the market price, nobody's going to buy from them because there's many other opportunities from them to buy from their competitors. And there's no reason for the firm to price beneath the market price, because why would you? If you could sell at the market price, why would you limit the amount of money that you could get for your products by trying to undercut your competition? You're not going to entice anybody away from their product, purchasing their product, because you can buy just as much at the market price. So, because of this, the demand curve that a firm within a perfectly competitive industry faces is horizontal, and or perfectly elastic. So just remember that that's how it's going to be drawn. And when you draw graphs in the perfectly competitive industry, often you're asked to draw one for the industry and then one for a representative firm. So on the left, we're going to talk, that's the industry. So price is set by all firms within the industry when the supply curves for each individual firm are horizontally added up. That S, that red supply curve, is the supply curve for the industry. And then demand is downward sloping. So for this industry, price is set at 10. And remember, when you do this, that you draw a dotted line from the industry to the firm This is the firm's demand curve, which is horizontal, because they can sell as much as they want at the price of 10. So, because of this, you should recognize that demand there's a lot of characteristics. So demand is equal to price here. And the additional revenue for selling an additional unit, so that would be the marginal revenue, right? What's the change in total revenue due to the change in output? And it's constant for a perfectly competitive firm, right? Because each additional unit that you sell, you can get $10 in this case. The first unit earns 10, the second unit earns 10, and so the marginal revenue is constant at 10. So total revenue is increasing at a constant rate here. And also, marginal revenue is equal to average revenue. And so often we will label that demand curve in the following way. Marginal revenue equals D equals average revenue equals price. Some students will kind of memorize this by Mr. Darp, but I would suggest if you put this on the exam, you make sure that you keep the equal sign in between the abbreviations. So, make sure you remember this, that in perfect competition, that demand curve is horizontal, and the labeling would be MR equals D equals AR equals P. So now let's go for maximizing profit. So what's the goal of every business? Well, the goal of every business is to maximize profit. And they got to figure out how much to produce. So firms should continue to produce output until the additional revenue they get from that additional unit of output equals the additional cost. And so if the price is 10, that means their marginal revenue is 10. Should you produce another unit if the additional cost is 5? If the additional cost is 9? And then if the additional cost is 11? Well, it seems to me to make sense that you would if the additional cost is 5, and you would if it was 9, but you wouldn't if it was 11, because if it's 11, it's costing you more to produce than you are bringing in revenue, which in this case is 10. So the profit maximizing rule, which you must memorize, but understand why it exists, is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And this is an important rule. So let's put the cost and revenue curves together to calculate profit. So here we have the industry on the left and the firm on the right. Make sure that you label them properly. Horizontal demand at 7. And then you put on top of that the marginal cost and, in this case, the average total cost curve. Often you don't have to put, the average fixed cost or the average variable cost. Sometimes the average variable cost, but you don't want it to get too messy. So we're going to focus on ATC right now. So based on our decision rule for marginal revenue equals marginal cost, how much output should this firm produce? So the firm, go to the point of intersection where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and then drop a dotted line down to the quantity axis. So this firm should produce 9. Any less than 9, they'll gain more in revenue than it costs them, and any more than 9, it'll cost them more than they bring in revenue. So total revenue can be found by, it's the area under that demand curve up to the point of 9. So it's that rectangle. And So that rectangle, if you were to look at the area of that rectangle, it's length times width, so 7 times 9 is 63. So that's the revenue to the firm.